Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the webinar. We're going to give just one more minute to see if more attendees join. We're currently at 10 individuals and we have 28 registered for the webinar. So we'll begin in one more minute. Welcome to this month's webinar. My name is Carl Grindle and I serve Delta Upsilon Fraternity as the Associate Executive Director, and I'm joined by...
I'm Ashley Martin. I'm the Director of Communications here for Delta Upsilon.
We are pleased to co-host this month's advisor webinar on crisis management and communication. We would be remiss if we didn't offer our appreciation for your support of Delta Upsilon and its undergraduate members. Thank you for serving in your advisor roles. Without you as advisors, many of our chapters would not have the success they have today, so thank you. A few logistical items for this webinar. It will be recorded and available for use after today in this week's Friday Fast Breaks email. Any resources referenced during our time together are available on our website, and any questions are welcomed, and we'll have a time at the end of the webinar for those questions. And you can use the question box to the right or left of your screen in the GoToWebinar software to send us your questions during the Q&A session. Thank you for joining us. So why crisis management and communication as a topic for this month? Well, one, it's frequently been a requested topic during our advisor meetings and trainings. And most recently at our Advisors Academy in February, it was one of the most valued sessions we received feedback on. And it's a topic we've received many questions on over the year. Unfortunately, due to recent headlines in the news, poor behavior by some chapters, not just DU chapters, it's become a rising topic with alumni and advisors about what to do in a crisis. So let's begin. What is a crisis? A crisis is defined as a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. And clearly, any of us that have been in a situation before as a crisis know that it's difficult and troubling to be a part of. If an issue has one or more of the following characteristics, it could be a potential crisis. This helps you to use additional lenses to evaluate what may or may not be happening with your chapter on a given campus. So, any incident that may impact the reputation of the chapter, of the Delta Upsilon International Fraternity, or fraternities in general might be a crisis. When you expect media coverage, anytime that an incident may generate a response from the campus community, university leadership, the international fraternity, or our higher education influencers, or any time that the chapter closure or major sanctions may be announced. Why is crisis management important? It's important because it's the process by which we deal with a major incident that threatens and harms our constituents' integrity. And now more than ever, it's relevant to the sustainability of our future as an organization. An organization cannot just react to a crisis, but it needs to have a plan in place on how it's going to respond in an emergency. I think what we see now within a crisis management response is when you're just reacting and you don't have a established plan is when organizations really struggle. Our response in a crisis will not only help us to recount the situation, but it will help to shape the public perception of Delta Upsilon. I believe crisis management is deceptively simple, yet requires great discipline to be successful. You need to keep to the plan and you need to stay on message. So what's a crisis for Delta Upsilon? Clearly any death, bodily injury, an incident involving property damage during a chapter event or at the chapter house, a fire, sexual misconduct allegations, a severe hazing incident, any incident related to intolerance, such as issues related to racism, bigotry, anti-LGBTQ issues, etc. Arrest of a member or criminal charges filed, or natural disasters. We experienced a number of issues this last fall with incidents related to hurricane and hurricane relief. And so we always need to have a plan in place for those natural disasters. Some general crisis management tips. First and foremost, call 911. We need to always encourage our members to seek the appropriate emergency help. Many of the issues we see turn into a crisis could have been averted if only the students would have called 911 and sought help. So we need to ensure the students and our members feel comfortable doing so. In working with the crisis, the students need to work with first responders to make sure everyone's safe and attended to. If the incident occurred at the chapter facility or at a campus event, the chapter president is in charge of the situation. It's always important to have a point of contact and a spokesperson, and in our crisis management scenarios, that's always the chapter president. If he's not available, it should be another member of the executive board who can take his place. We always need to take a head count of the members or guests to make sure everyone's accounted for. And having a phone tree is a good and efficient way to get a hold of everyone. Group messaging works there as well, given today's technology availability. All members should work cooperatively and honestly with law enforcement or first responders. Cooperating and being honest is our best course in any of these scenarios. We need to encourage all of our members never to lie or to cover up any incident, because the truth usually rises to the surface. The chapter members need to immediately let a chapter advisor know what is happening, and then they need to call the campus fraternity and sorority life staff to notify them as well. Once those individuals have been notified, the staff here at the headquarters would like to be notified as well. You can contact either the chapter staff liaison, you can contact our Director of Loss Prevention, Dr. Sarah Ray, you can contact myself, or you can contact our Executive Director. Any of those individuals will immediately respond to an emergency and begin our crisis management protocol. The next step that's important is that once the situation has calmed down or the incident has subsided, that the chapter president or the VP of loss prevention or chapter advisor completes the incident report form. That incident report form is online and it is monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so as soon as that incident report form is received, a staff member is able to respond to the chapter appropriately and provide advice and guidance, as well as begin our own review of the situation. That incident report, though, needs to be submitted within 24 hours. The sooner we get the information, the more honest and clear the information we receive is, the better we're able to respond, and we're able to forward to the appropriate parties that will help us through this situation. During this time as well, we want to ask all members to refrain from posting about the situation on social media or speaking about it with those outside of the situation. We do that to prevent the rumor mill from churning as information is still being learned, and it also protects the privacy of those involved. It also allows us to have a fair due process when it comes to either a campus judicial process, the fraternity's judicial process, or any legal situation that may arise from an incident. Speculating on what happens or pointing fingers helps no one. Members need to continue to work cooperatively with any authorities, campus administration or advisors, or the fraternity staff as any investigations continue. That cooperation is important. If you feel parents or alumni need to be contacted, you can work with the fraternity staff to develop clear and consistent messaging. We also always recommend that any individual member that may personally be involved in an incident contact his parents directly to inform them of the issues so they can determine an appropriate plan of action for that member. Any questions about fire and police operations or investigations should be directed to the appropriate public safety official. The chapter, nor our advisors or the fraternity staff are the appropriate experts to respond to those specific questions about a fire or police investigation that may be going on. Those departments have their own protocols and have the ability to respond in the official capacity. If asked about the conditions of any injured member or individual, we need to direct all reporters to the appropriate public safety official or the hospital. Because of medical privacy laws or HIPAA, you cannot release information. It's also important to note here that student members or chapter advisors shouldn't be the individuals making contact with parents or family regarding the death of a student. That really needs to come from a medical official or a law enforcement official within their official capacity. That is their place. It's important to note here that Delta Upsilon really is servicing two roles in the account of a crisis, and that is a role of advocating and coordinating, and then another role of investigation and accountability. For the sake of this call, when we really look at DU's role, it's really in that advocate and coordinate column as we work to coordinate responses with members of the chapter, the university community or administration, alumni, parents, and media. We do that so we can advise undergraduate chapter and advisory boards on steps to be taken, best practices, items like that, as well as to assist the chapter in the local campus judicial process. We know that the chapter officers and chapter advisors need the assistance in those areas as we coordinate through a crisis situation. Unfortunately, usually due to a crisis, there's also potentially a violation of the fraternity's loss prevention policy. And so the fraternity does have a responsibility to investigate and hold chapters or members accountable for what occurred during that crisis or incident. And so it's important to note that we still take that role very seriously, and we will investigate the violations of our loss prevention policy. We will determine if there's a responsibility assigned to the chapter or individuals. We'll work to coordinate the judicial proceedings with our judicial committee volunteers, and we'll assign any sanctions as appropriate and be the spokesperson for any final decision from the judicial committee or the board of directors. But as I said, really our role here in a crisis is to advocate and coordinate on behalf of the chapter to ensure that we're providing the appropriate messaging. And as we talk about that messaging, we're going to switch, and Ashley's going to take us through some of the next steps.
Yeah, so I'm here today to talk to you about the communications piece of managing a crisis. Most times this is going to be a reactionary response from the fraternity about an event, but no matter the situation, those of us at IHQ are here to help you manage that. When a crisis occurs, there are multiple audiences we need to think about: media, members, alumni, and parents, most particularly. I'll spend most of my time today walking you through IHQ's process when it comes to crisis communications and give tips on how to handle media, but I will touch on those other three audiences briefly. But before I get to that, I want to give you the three most important things I think there are to remember when doing crisis communications. The first one being, let IHQ run point on messaging. There's a few reasons for this. One being, we have experience in this. We do this for all DU chapters and have done so for several years. So we can draw on these past experiences to manage your crisis in the best way possible. We also have access to the PR firm that the NIC keeps on retainer if we need to reach out to them. Edelman is a major international firm that has handled crisis for Fortune 500 companies, several universities, and to now the NIC. And most importantly, it frees up your time to handle the nuts and bolts of managing a crisis. So let me take the immediate inquiries off your hands. You'll have enough going on. Second thing to remember is be honest, with us. Make sure that incident report form that Carl mentioned is filled out immediately and as completely as possible, and keep us updated when more information is learned. We know that a lot of times right at the beginning, we might not know all the facts, but to keep us in the loop as we learn more is important. And then 3, don't panic. This may be your first time that your chapter has had a media inquiry or dealt with this particular crisis, but from our standpoint, it's not our first. And so when managed properly, the media will eventually move on to something else. I think it's important for everyone to remember that the story may seem bigger to you than it really is. You know, you're in the thick of it, you're looking for the news articles, your friends are asking you about it, but we have a tool through Edelman that monitors the reach of any story that mentions DU, and I'll tell you that to you, it may feel like it's all that anyone is talking about, but most times stories don't make it out of their local communities and only last for a few days. So as I said, I think it could be beneficial for you to know what goes on behind the scenes here at IHQ when we are handling crisis communication. So hopefully knowing our process may help explain some of the best practices that I'll give later on. So first, from my end, most often than not, I hear about a communication or crisis from Carl. A chapter has notified him, Sarah, or another staff member, or that chapter has filled out the incident report form. Sometimes we may hear it from a Google alert, a notification through our Edelman dashboard, or a reporter themselves, but most often than not, we're hearing about a crisis directly from the chapter. After we've learned about the crisis, Carl and I sit down and we go over all the details. Sometimes that will require us to reach out to you, the advisors, the chapter, or the university for more information, but really this step in our process is the most critical. For us to make the best statement possible, we need all the known facts to that point. It helps us prepare the best statement and to be able to forecast what could happen next or what might need to be said later on. We never want to get into a situation where we say something and then have to backtrack later on because there was information that wasn't told to us. And through this process, we may ask some questions that might not seem relevant to you or information that isn't a big deal, but know that we are asking them for a reason because this is the most important step in our process. So after we've done our background research, we reach out to the chapter to remind them of the crisis communications protocol. There's a tip sheet that I'll send out to the chapter president and the advisors. It can also be found online, but the main point of this tip sheet is really as a reminder to let IHQ run point on the messaging. After that, I inform the NIC, and this is really just a courtesy so that they're aware. They typically help us monitor the situation and will offer advice. They may also know some campus background that we don't know since they're working with all the other fraternities on that campus as well. And if we do need to reach out to Edelman, the PR firm, for additional assistance, we'll do so at this point. After this, I will draft a statement, and I work with Justin and Carl to approve that, and sometimes that means we'll run it by the NIC or Edelman for an extra set of eyes, but we'll work on a statement there. Next is I wait for the media to contact me. I will email them the statement that we've written to anyone who asks for it. So if a reporter calls here at the office, I will talk to them briefly, but it's really just to ask for their email, and I'll send them that statement via email. I think it's important to note that we do not do live TV or radio broadcasts. So if a reporter does reach out to me with follow-up questions after reading the statement, I'll ask them to email those questions to me as opposed to answering them over the phone. We don't want to get into a situation where they're baiting us into a question that we might not be prepared to answer. Next, we will work with the advisors and the chapter officers to determine if any messaging is needed to be sent to parents or alumni. Particularly with these messages, we will use your input heavily to draft these messages. As we said before, you know these audiences better than us, and you may have a relationship with them, so we really value your input here in this stage. Then after that, we just continue to follow up with the chapter for more information. So if additional statements are needed, we'll go through this process again. So now that I've kind of gone over our internal process, I'll go over some best practices for dealing with the media that I'll send once a crisis happens. So really, any incident has a potential to generate immediate inquiry, but as Carl mentioned earlier, here is what we see most often in the news. So these are hazing allegations, sexual assault allegations, the member accident or death, and this does not have to be fraternity related. Oftentimes the reporter will see that this individual is a member of the fraternity and reach out to us, even if it didn't have anything to do with a fraternity related event. We also see incidents and allegations regarding intolerance when a chapter receives a university sanction, and here in the last year, particularly when a university implements new rules or guidelines for the Greek community. We've seen an influx in media inquiries in this regard in the last year. So as I said, IHQ will run point on crisis communications for any situation, but there are definitely things at the chapter level that need to be done to help us out with this. The first one, as Carl mentioned earlier, the chapter president is that local point person. When an accident or an incident happens, a reporter's first response is not to call us here at the international headquarters. They're going to call the chapter. And so they should be going to the chapter president. They may go to others first, not the chapter president, so it is important to know that chapter members know that they should not comment on the incident and refer those reporters to the chapter president. Once the chapter president gets those inquiries, he has one of two options. He can either forward the inquiry straight to me without responding to the reporter, or he can respond to the reporter and say something like, "Thanks for reaching out. Please contact our international headquarters for a statement or to answer any questions." And he can give them my direct contact information. It's important to remember to never say no comment. That statement in itself is a comment, and it makes it look like we have something to hide. If you don't want to talk to a reporter, I would much rather you ignore them. It is perfectly okay to forward a voicemail or email on to me without responding to the reporter directly. I will always get back to someone who's reached out to us. If a reporter does track you down in person, it is okay to keep your head down and keep walking and not engage with them. If you do engage with them, however, it is important to remember to be polite. Keep a straight face, don't yell at them to go away, don't pick a fight. And if you do want to say something, just politely say, "I'm not the best person to answer your question. Please reach out to the chapter president or the international headquarters." This next one is a big one that you as advisors can help us out with, and this is to make sure that the chapter property is clean, that there's no trash in the yard, that there are no inappropriate signs or banners in the windows, and nothing that could make a political statement. You never know when a camera crew is going to show up and do a live shot outside the chapter facility, or when a photographer is going to come by and take a photo. So we don't want them to find beer cans in the yard, a Confederate flag in the window, or anything of that nature. Next, it's important if you have a chapter facility to make sure your staff knows not to speak to reporters. So if a reporter comes to the front door, make sure the cook, the handyman, the house director, whoever knows to say, "I'm not the best person to answer your questions." I have seen an instance where reporters have gotten from a lawn care worker to talk about how often he's had to pick beer cans up out of the yard. So to make sure that those folks know not to talk to reporters either. And as Carl mentioned earlier, chapters should go silent on social media, particularly in the immediate aftermath. The chapter accounts should be quiet. This shows that we're taking the crisis seriously and prioritizing it over other activities that may be going on. And then from the individual standpoint, those members don't need to go completely silent on social media, but they shouldn't comment on the incident. They also shouldn't post things that could be related to the incident. The media will look for members on social media most often than not. So if a member is commenting on the crisis, these posts can be viewed as and used as a statement. The same goes for past posts. Even in the case of advisors, we've seen reporters go through their past posts to try to get more background information on a situation or the chapter as a whole. Then in terms of not posting things related to the crisis, here's what I mean. If the chapter has had a major alcohol violation, it's best that the members don't then a few days later post a picture of themselves at a tailgate or at a bar again, it's best to keep our heads down and our noses clean until the storm passes. And it is important to remember that if it's a big incident, IHQ will do the same. We will let our digital media coordinator know to not post anything on our accounts in the immediate when something has happened. So know that some of the things that we're asking you to do on the chapter level, we are also doing here on the international level. Lastly, I'll touch on members, parents, and alumni quickly. These groups are going to know what's going on in a crisis, and they'll want to hear directly from us and not get their information from the news. We do, however, need to be careful about how much information we share and the timing of when we share it. It's our job to put everyone at ease without getting too in the weeds. So especially in the early stages, we may not have all the information, and as Carl said earlier, it's never good to speculate. It is okay for us to say we don't know at this time, but we're working to find out more. And so sometimes if there's an open university or police investigation, there will be things that we simply can't share, even if we do know it. There have been times where we have provided more information to parents and alumni than we have to the news, to then have those parents and alumni turn around and share those messages with the media. So we've learned from past examples here in this instance. So some best practices in working with members, alumni, and parents. The first one is talk to the chapter in person. So instead of sending emails to the membership or texting back and forth with them, meet with them in person. This allows them to ask questions. It shows that you care. And sometimes if information is sensitive, we don't want to put it in writing. So encourage chapter members to talk to one another about the incident in person as well. Again, texts, emails, group messages, they can all be screenshot and shown to others. So we want to make sure that we're doing things in person or over the phone, and then to make sure that you're careful of your surroundings. So if two of the chapter members are talking about the incident, they're not doing it in the campus cafeteria at a high traffic time where others may hear what's going on. And then again, work with IHQ on messaging. You know the members, the alumni, and the parents the best. As I said, you have a relationship with them, and they may want to hear from you and not us as an international headquarters. But let us help you craft those messages so that we can look for things like tone, context of messaging, the level of information shared, and things like that. Throughout the entire crisis communications process, I'm in defend and protect mode. It's my job to share the appropriate message that shows we are taking things seriously, while at the same time trying to limit the reach of the story and the length of the news cycle. And so I think now we're going to go through some real life scenarios of some crises that we've had that we have learned a lot from. One of them is kind of a multifaceted scenario. So last spring, we had a chapter with a member death. This student was on his way to an out-of-town fraternity formal, but before he made it inside, he got into an accident and tragically passed away. So at this point, we worked with the chapter so that we could have a statement until we learned more information, because there was a police investigation going on in this accident. We kept alumni and parents updated on what was going on. It was in the news, and wanted to make sure that they were hearing from us as to what was going on. We also helped the chapter navigate honoring his life without speculating on what had happened while the investigation was still going on. So while that investigation was still happening, they were getting some media inquiries, but teaching them how to focus it on his life and their honoring of him, and steering the conversation away from speculating about what had happened. So same chapter, year later, we have a handful of members who are under police investigation for possibly selling drugs. So here at this point, we needed to clarify with the media that it wasn't a chapter issue, but it was an issue with some individuals. We also needed to do the same with parents and alumni, and to make sure that parents were assured that their sons were okay and safe, and that it wasn't a chapter issue. And then needed to monitor what information was shared to all audiences, because there was active police and university investigations going on here. So while we had some information that we could have shared for the best interest of our members and their protection, chose not to share that information. Media was also showing up at the chapter house at this time, so we had to make sure that the chapter was prepared for how to handle that as well. Unfortunately, a few weeks after this incident, another member passed away. This time he had taken his own life. So we handled this member death very differently than we had handled the member death a year prior. Knowing that these other two incidents had happened in the last year really affected how we communicated this one. While the three scenarios weren't related, we needed to be prepared for the media to try to draw a connection between the three incidents, even though it didn't actually exist. So there was a lot of forethought and planning that went around this one to monitor anything that could arise from that situation. Another situation I want to touch on briefly is one that happened a few years ago. It was an instance where a chapter allegedly used hate speech. This was on a campus where there had been some racial issues outside of Greek life in the last year or so. The chapter members claimed they didn't do it, but at first we didn't have any real proof. It was really a he said, she said type of situation. So as we were working to figure out with the university and the advisors what really did happen, we needed to make sure that we were not speculating on what was happening and really taking the time to investigate what was going on. In the meantime, the guys, understandably, really wanted to defend themselves in this situation. So they took to the chapter's Twitter and tweeted out the definition of the word allegedly. Individual members then got onto Twitter and were arguing with people. Alumni, while well-intentioned and wanting to help, then started commenting on articles online, on social media and things of that nature, and parents were forwarding messages we were sending them to the media. All of this fueled the fire, and so what was a smaller story at that point became a national story at that point, and really because while understandably the chapter wanted to defend themselves and get their story out, weren't heeding our advice when we said, let's take a step back and be quiet for a little bit until we figure out what's going on. So in summary, I think that the best is to be honest with us and work with us. Every crisis is very nuanced, and communications needs to be nuanced as well. And so without careful thought and planning, things can snowball. We don't want our chapters or advisors to get into a situation with the media that they aren't prepared for. So let us help you in these situations.
Thank you, Ashley. And I think it's important to note that each crisis or incident is always handled on its own facts. We evaluate the information we know, the potential outcome or reach of the incident, and what's the appropriate response. We always do our best to, while we use best practice, to also be custom in our response and in our advice to the chapter, the undergraduate, advisors, alumni, and parents. Now we're going to open it up for questions. So give me one moment here. As a reminder, again, if you have a question, please use the question box in the GoToMeeting application. So there was a question posed as to an alcohol incident not being included in our list of most common, or our list of potential crises. Is it because it's usually a common occurrence? Really, I guess when I look at an alcohol incident, I usually tie that to the death, bodily injury, or even a severe hazing incident or a sexual misconduct allegation. It could be classified on its own depending upon what the facts are, but for the sake of this webinar, really had considered it lumped in with some of the other larger, more major examples. We have another question here. One moment.
Our question box is very small, so it's only letting us see one line at a time, so it's making reading the questions a little difficult.
So one question was, is this training mandatory for the chapter president and the number 2 or any of the other executive board officers? I wouldn't say it's mandatory, but we do provide this training at each of our regional leadership academies, as well as a session during the Leadership Institute during its educational program. And then over the last couple of years, we have had specific loss prevention training sessions with chapter presidents during the President's Academy. And so they're receiving some of this information in different forms throughout that process. It's also included in all of our officer materials. So anytime that there is a chapter visit by a staff member and they're reviewing officer transition and officer training, this material is referenced.
I would add to that, as Carl mentioned, during officer training, that's a good point for the officers to review the crisis communications protocol. But as I said before, when an incident happens, I will reach out to chapters at that moment and give them a refresher. So I do think it's good for them to read up on it in advance as they start their new offices, but as a reminder that we will reach out to them in the moment and give them those reminders at that time. We know that in the thick of things, sometimes what you've heard at a educational program or read during your officer training, you might not remember. So we will reach out to them at that point and give them those tips and best practices.
So we have a question here, and says, at what point is an event that is reported considered a violation against loss prevention? Should our members report minor events or be careful on what is reported? Our recommendation is that a chapter report any incident that occurs that could cause the chapter to be sanctioned by the university or the fraternity, as well as anything that involves bodily injury, damage, etc. One, so we have accurate reporting. 2, it is part of the loss prevention policy that a chapter is to self-report. Really, in any incident, it's in the chapter's best interest to be the ones to bring it forth, and when they do so, identify what they're doing to address that problem and how they're going to resolve it or what action they're taking. I think one of the great things about being a part of a fraternity is the self-governance and peer accountability, and it's something that a number of our chapters, I think, have gotten away from over time. And that, in my opinion, and I think with the fraternity's judicial committee, the more open the chapter is with an incident that's occurred, the action they've taken and how they're going to prevent that in the future, that's really what the committee is looking for, is that the chapter has evaluated what occurred, has held those members accountable for that behavior, and they have a plan in place to prevent that in the future. So I encourage any incident to be reported to us. In terms of when is it identified as a violation or not, really that's determined based upon the facts. And so either the staff during its investigation will determine is there a violation of our loss prevention policy or not. And if there isn't, then we'll just handle the crisis or the incident as such and respond with advocacy and coordinating any messaging out. If there is a violation or a potential violation, then we will work with our judicial committee to determine a finding of fact, and then work with the chapter on educational programming and next steps. The next question, do new associate members receive training on how to respond? Again, there is training. We do talk about this, again, if an associate member is at any one of our educational programs for the fraternity, whether that be the Leadership Institute, the Regional Leadership Academy, or the like. One of the elements we'll talk about towards the end today is, now what? How does the chapter move this forward? And I think an element that's really important is that not only the loss prevention policies are reviewed with each new associate member class, but also the crisis management policy. Each chapter needs to have its own crisis management plan, and that needs to be reviewed not only with the new members, but also with the chapter. And I recommend every semester that there's some review of that plan and policy so everybody is aware. And we'll answer one more question. So what is the last question? What is the number one thing not to do? In my opinion, don't lie. I think as we approach any crisis, if we're honest and transparent with the facts that we know, it allows us to, or the fraternity, to be able to assist the chapter in the best response possible. I've operated on, I guess, the following premise: the quality of my information determines the quality of my decision. And so the more high quality information, the more open and honest we are in communication with undergraduates, chapter advisors, alumni, parents, etc., the better our information is, the more that we can provide real valuable help and assistance in addressing the issue. And as we see across all levels of a crisis in any organization, the crisis or the incident is only heightened when there's a perceived sense of cover-up or leaving information out. And so the more we can encourage our student leaders to be open and honest when there is an incident and sharing that information, I think the better we are. I guess I would also say the number one thing to do in a crisis is to ask for help. And so that would be, if needed, calling 911, seeking emergency medical personnel and assistance. And in some situations, it may not be a crisis of life or limb. And so then it's reaching out to you all as chapter advisors or the international fraternity or even the campus to seek assistance with other incidents that may be going on, and that they're able to respond. And while some of our student leaders have had significant life experiences, the extent of which most of them have had that to be able to respond to a major crisis, I think, is limited. And so they need to really reach out and seek help when appropriate, and allow those that have a little more experience or a little more expertise in a specific area to help them. And so I would say don't lie and do ask for help. So as we conclude, I want to offer a bit of, I guess, now what? And to some of the questions that were asked, I think it speaks to what can you do leaving this webinar, how can you help your chapter members? I think first and foremost, we need to ensure all of our chapter officers have the appropriate education and training on this topic, whether that's being encouraged to participate in these programs at the Leadership Institute this summer, during the regional leadership academies in February, or any of the other educational programs that we offer, to come and receive and hear the information we have. There's also a significant amount of information on our website, as well as on the campus website locally that will be able to help you. These policies need to be reviewed with each new member class during their associate member education training, and the policies need to be reviewed with all members at least on an annual basis, if not every semester. If you don't tell them what you're going to tell them, they forget. And so we need to consistently be preparing this material and placing it in front of our membership so they're aware and understand what's expected of them in these times. We also believe that role-playing with new officers during an officer transition through this crisis management process is important. You can select a few topics that may be specific to your campus or to a situation that you've heard about in the news. We have a number of topics we can provide you as well to help seed their thoughts, but help them to run through those scenarios and what they would do in that time of crisis to understand, are they able to put together the right steps and follow the plan of action in place. You need to have open and honest conversations with the chapter about what it should be prepared for. And you should share your expectations for the chapter on how they'll handle a crisis and communicate with you in that moment. But most importantly, every chapter should have a plan, and that plan should be followed at all times. That's the most important lesson from this day. In conclusion, we want to thank you for taking the time to learn about crisis management and communications. We hope you found this beneficial. If there are any unanswered questions, please feel free to contact us directly and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. This recorded webinar should be available within the next week and again will be included in this Friday's Friday Fast Break email. On behalf of Delta Upsilon, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your service and have a great Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.